I want to talk to you about the very subject that brings us together, and that is the word sociology, sociology, and it's hard to get all those syllables in. I want to talk to you about sociology. And I know many of you have had other experiences with sociology or with the other social sciences. And in fact, this gives me an opportunity to learn something from you. So I would like to know, first of all, how many of you are new to NYU this term? Raise your hand. Oh, okay, a good number. Thank you. How many of you are in your first year of any university? Raise your hand. Wow. Okay, great. Thank you. So we have a room of young people, it's safe to assume. And again, a hearty welcome. I don't really remember when I was in your situation, but I have some photographs, which maybe I'll share at some point during this semester and pass it along. How many of you have had another sociology class somewhere in the world? A couple of you. And how about anthropology? A handful. And economics. And political science. And psychology. Okay, thanks so much. History. All right. I saw a lot of hands go up for quite a number of those disciplines when I asked about it. I could have asked about others like geography and planning. And what's interesting for the present purpose is that sociology includes, touches on, borders, all of those fields. And you will see that as the semester goes on, that sociology has a kind of its own space, but it is adjacent to all of those other spaces. And in fact, many fields, like communications, for example, emerged out of sociology. The field of demography, the study of population, was born out of sociology. Studies of various versions of history were born out of sociology. And in fact, one of the great sociological thinkers, a founder of the discipline, sometimes a French theorist whose name was Auguste Comte. Whoops, I'm just learning, by the way, this whole exciting world of electronics. And, oh, I know what I got to do. I know, don't give me any clues. I know what I've got to do. There we go, like that. See the way it works? It's just something fantastic. I'm going to get better at this as the semester goes on. I know I have got to put it back, and now I go like that. Oh man, I'm just no good. Okay, I'll practice every night for 10 minutes until I get this right. I'll roll my R's to improve my Italian. Okay, so that's a nice little pattern, isn't it? So I know what I was doing. I wanted to give you the name of a dead European, and Auguste Comte. And he, a philosopher of the, what century? Is it 17th century? Where's it? Do we know? I'm getting confirmed on that, 17th century. Called sociology the queen of the sciences. And he meant that in a positive way, that sociology is the centerpiece of all of these other disciplines. Because sociology, after all, is about human beings, and it is about human beings interacting together. It is about what happens when human beings interact together. So whether it's their economic relationships, their relationships of power as the political scientists take it up, whether it comes out of their psychology, the fact that they are together and what comes out of that phenomenon is the subject matter of sociology. And that being together kind of thing, what results from that, is what also gives rise to all of these other disciplines, which are all about social relations in one form or another. But sociology is the heart of it. So let's start with some sociology. The first part of this course, the heading for it, is the sociological imagination who we are and how we got here. And I want to give you one way of answering that question. The very term, the sociological imagination, was coined by a professor who was at Columbia University, and he died not so long ago. He died quite young, in fact, but when I was young, he was about to die. So just to give you a sense of the historic periods. And his name was C. Wright Mills, a professor at Columbia University. And he wrote numbers of books, but one book, a very famous book, is called The Sociological Imagination. And that's what you were assigned to read from. And so what I'm going to do right now is speak about, in effect, the Mills version of sociology. It isn't the only one, but it's a favorite and has survived for a long, long time. So what is the sociological imagination? It is virtually like any kind of sociology, the idea that it matters who's around, that we can answer the question. Let's try to be a little bit non-sociological as a way of getting started. If I ask you, why are we here? You might say, well, I had to take something between 11 and 12:15. That would be an answer, because I work after 12:15 and I can't get up early. So that's why I'm here. That's one kind of way of answering it. There are many other ways of answering that question as well, which is that I performed well on tests, and so therefore I was able to get into NYU. My family has a lot of money, and they're able to pay for my tuition at NYU. I love NYU. I came here as a child and was just blown away by a school whose colors were violet and eggshell. That really was a place that I wanted to go to. There are many ways of answering that question of how we got here, and some of those ways fit with the idea of the sociological imagination and how Mills would go about explaining what goes on. The number one thing that Mills would say, I think, is that, or maybe it's the number two, but a critical thing Mills would say is that we have to look beyond the individual and their own sense of how they got to be where they are in life or in geographical space. That you may think that NYU is a groovy school, and that's why you are here. You chose NYU. Maybe you'll even add in that NYU chose you, and so you're here. But much more is going on than that, and that we are all buffeted constantly by the forces of history, the forces of social class, the forces of race, the forces of gender. All of these kinds of factors and forces are shaping all of our behavior, and pretty much all the time, I'll try to convince you, as the semester goes on. And only by understanding how those forces intersect, and in this case, at the level of a particular individual, each of us, can you understand and answer a question like, why are we here? The why are we here is really a question for investigation. The answer is to be found, Mills would say, at the intersection of biography and history. So each of us is living our lives, getting up in the morning. We came out of the womb at an earlier point, and it's been really one meal after another, and one session of sleep after another as we've gone forward. But we haven't gone forward like a little motorboat isolated in the world. Instead, as we've gone forward, all of these other forces are shaping, buffeting, determining, altering that course of our existence. And only by getting a handle on those forces will we understand where we are and why we are where we are. Mills was very oriented toward problems in society. He was oriented toward individual problems, And you will see that Mills did this writing 50, 60 years ago, and his repertoire of problems he speaks of aren't exactly the same problems as we would speak of today, but problems, for example, of race, of illness, of healthcare and its access, of economic deprivation, of unemployment. If you can't get a job, one way of thinking about the fact that you can't get a job is that there's something I've done wrong. I should have not gone to NYU. I certainly should have not majored in sociology. I should have gone to Carnegie Mellon and gotten a degree in engineering, for example. I made the wrong decision, and that's why I'm employed. Or I don't have any real get up and go. I don't have skill. I don't have talent. I can't get up in the morning. That's why I can't get a job. The alternative is to ask, what is going on with the national economy these days? How did that happen? What kinds of political, economic, global forces created the economy we're in right now? How is it that the economy values one kind of job and not another kind of job? I love taking care of small children. I want to be a daycare teacher. Even if I get a job as a daycare teacher, I won't be able to pay rent or eat, attract a mate. I won't be able to do any of those things. How is it that this kind of a job is paid so little compared to, say, being a fighter pilot on a jet plane or being a plumber? How come plumbers make 3 or 4 or 5 times what a daycare teacher makes? Is it something about plumbing that's more important than helping a child develop, or just what? Maybe that's why I can't get a job. Maybe that's why I can't make a living. It's about the structure of the situation and the way these forces have evolved over history such that this is just the way it's going to be. Just as a small footnote, doctors in countries in which the doctors are primarily women receive lower income than countries in which the doctors are primarily men. So maybe it's not something about doctoring that pays well or doesn't pay well, but it's something about the surrounding society and the way it's emerged over history that determines whether something is going to be good or not going to be good. Individual troubles, which I've given you a few examples of, are public issues. And that's a very important, another idea from C. Wright Mills. People who tend to go around seeing their life as a series of private troubles are missing the boat. They should be seeing the relationship between their private troubles and public issues. That's, I think, the second leg of the Mills argument. And you see, when they do that, when they see that, well, wait a minute, I love children, I'm devoting myself to that. Children are important in society. Well, wait a minute, that should be paid well. Or wait a minute, I'm not getting this job because I'm a woman. Or I'm not getting this job because I'm Hispanic. There's something wrong with that. That then leads to, once you see there's something wrong with that, taking political action. The solution is not to enroll in Kaplan or go to church or synagogue. The answer is in political and collective moral action. I have to join up, and this is the political action. It isn't just that I now go vote for President Obama as opposed to President Bush. It's that I find other people who are similarly situated to me, men who want to do child care, African Americans who want to be president of the United States, whatever it might be. I have to link up with people who are in a way in the same predicament I am, caused by the same forces of history and culture and politics and all the rest of it. And we have to become agents for change. We have to organize. We have to be together. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains, as Marx said. Or Gays of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your stigma. Women of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your indignity and your poverty and whatever else it might be. So now you see a series of things that are interlinked, which is that, and some other punchlines that you get from C. Wright Mills. And that is that the sociologist, if they're following the sociological imagination full force, is engaged. And it is something that not only does the sociologist have the sociological imagination with these multiple steps that I've outlined, but everyone should. It's about citizenship. It's about living a dignified life. You've heard the phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living. This is the non-sociologically examined life. I don't know if Mills would go so far as to say is not worth living, but it would be something like, is a much better life and will create a better world, and not just for some highfalutin moral reason of a better world, but it will create a better life for me if I can get the whole thing organized in a way that is more fulfilling, more liberatory, more equal in its opportunity structures. Everyone will be better off. So this then, the sociological imagination, is a call for political action. And it means that when you have the sociological imagination, whether you're a professional sociologist like I am, or you're a citizen who is a plumber or a child care worker or a physician, whatever that might be, that you are engaged in the world. You are not just trying to understand the world, you're trying to change the world. And your efforts to understand the world are so that you can change it. You have to be very careful, you have to be very thorough, you have to be very systematic, because you want to try to learn, well, what are the wages, for example, of a child care worker? What happens when we can't attract the right people to that job? What kind of suffering do people experience, both the children and the adults, because of it? How does that work? It requires systematic scholarship. We're not born with that knowledge. It's not intuitive. So you have to carry out the craft of engaging in systematic observations, systematic data collection, surveys sometimes, like I did when we started this class, to find out what year you were all in. Of course, we do it in much more systematic and careful ways. We worry about sampling, and we have statistical techniques, and we have a lot of fancy stuff we do. But the goal is to then break through and create the kind of knowledge that is needed to generate change. So that is the C. Wright Mills image of what sociology is, or what sociology should be, and what citizenship should be. It's a very grand vision, isn't it? Because it includes history and politics and personal troubles and anxieties and worries and everyone. Sociology is too important to be left to the sociologists. It is everyone's job, and especially in a democratic society where presumably the power to act is distributed on a massive basis. Now, I should tell you that C. Wright Mills wasn't exactly the most important sociologist who ever lived while he was alive. And he had critics. And indeed, it's probably safe to say that a majority of the professional sociologists in the world really do not follow in the C. Wright Mills path. They get some of it, and they think it's kind of cool, this history and biography and all of that resonates with them. But the idea that sociology should have this built-in moral and political role in the world, that's a little more controversial, and not everybody is on board with that. And we're going to be reading, you'll be reading, from a dead German named, here, I'll put his first name is Max, and I've really mucked this up. That's a W, W-E-B-E-R, Max Weber. It looks like there's a barbecue grill called the Weber. And for some reason, we really pronounce this correctly. So people will laugh at you if you say Max Weber. He's German, and we call him Max Weber. And we're going to be reading Max Weber to get the alternative perspective. And some of you will want to read before we meet next time and pick up on your Max Weber. And I'm going to be talking about him next time. Now, what I want to do, though, is push on this sociological imagination a little bit more, but in a concrete way, to get back to this topic of the one I raised when we began the class, the topic of why are we here, how did we get here, and how can we explain that? Well, one avenue to explain that is one of the readings that you have, and it's from it's a book review from the New Yorker, written by a staff writer of the New Yorker who has now written many very, very popular books. His name is Malcolm Gladwell. He's very, very much alive, and Malcolm Gladwell typically rounds up social science and popularizes it, in part because he's a very beautiful writer. And so I'm sparing you the 700-page book that Malcolm Gladwell is writing about, a book called The Chosen by a sociologist at Berkeley named Jerome Karabel, and instead just giving you Malcolm Gladwell's review of it in the New Yorker. And what we learn, actually what we learn from Karabel's book, and what we learn as Gladwell tells it again, is how people actually get in to the schools that many of you did not get in. So one small twist to the explaining why are you here is why are you not at Harvard, Yale, or Princeton? And I won't ask for a show of hands of how many of you were turned down by Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. But a number of you were, just like a good large number of you turned down Stony Brook and Cornell and maybe the University of Chicago and Penn or Penn State, or I don't know what your list is of the schools that you got into but you chose not to go to. There is a hierarchy, and who gets to be in this privileged group? Now, Karabel could have done a study that just examined NYU, the University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins universities, that it's more a Boston University, that it's more parallel to, but he took on the kind of kings of the mountain, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, which are the most selective, almost, Brown is up there, selective universities in the United States. And he tells some interesting stories, and I think you'll enjoy when you have the opportunity to read about it. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton functioned essentially as finishing schools for the rich in the 18th and 19th centuries and well into the 20th century. And so if you were from a good family and your family had money and breeding and didn't have funny accents, then, and of course were white, goes without saying, then you basically had not just a shot, but if you were in the right social category, then that was the school that you went to. You went to one of those schools or some school like it. And there were family traditions of going to Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, or maybe Brown, or maybe one of the other Ivy Leagues. And that's where you ended up. The problem in the 20th century, after the great migrations from Europe, is that those great migrations from Europe included Jews. And Jews tended to do very well in school. And so they accomplished a whole lot in the public high schools which they went to. And they scored very well on the entrance tests to the degree which they had entrance tests, which in the many, many years before they never had entrance tests, because it was just the entrance test was birth and mode of family that you're from. But The problem was when they started to test people or take into account merit, the Jews did too well. And 20% of the entering class at Harvard became Jewish somewhere in the 1930s. And this created a crisis for Harvard because it didn't want to be Jew-U. And the idea was that it wouldn't be Harvard anymore, because Harvard is many things besides the offering of classes, people learning. That's the stuff you see in the catalog. When you open the catalog of Harvard, just as you open the catalog of NYU or the University of Michigan or whatever, it'll say something about transferring knowledge to the young, fulfilling the culture and transferring the culture from one generation to the next. Join us in this exciting undertaking of learning and build a better democracy. There's all variations on the theme. But my God, we don't want Jews doing that kind of thing here with us. We all know why. They're swarthy, they're short, they eat with their hands, they're loud, they're money grubbing. Have I offended you yet? We certainly don't want no Jews like that. The occasional Rothschild might be all right. But we don't want these Jews piling in. That redefines what we are. And we are for Harvard men. And of course, it is I failed to mention, the great gender issue. They took Jews before they took women. Women are yet to come. So Harvard had to do something about it. And now we're talking about not just Harvard, but the other Ivies had to do something about it as well. Little did they know that in the wings were Asians and Hispanics and blacks and other people of suspect ethnicity who might redefine what the place is. And so they used various techniques. One of them was geography and geographic distribution. So Harvard came up with the idea that it is important for students to learn from each other. And to do that, we need to have geographic distribution. We can't have everybody here come from the Bronx. We've got to have people from Montana, for example. And they'll look like Marlboro men. You've seen what they look like. And they'd be good to have here. Do we have anybody from Montana? No, we don't. What do you know? How'd that happen? So they decided that they would have regional quotas. So they're not discriminating against Jews. That what they are doing is instead a positive thing of generating a diverse student body. Since there are or were virtually no Jews in Montana, if you have a quota from Montana or from the Mountain West, then empirically you're going to generate a large number of non-Jewish applicants. There'll also be non-black and non-Hispanic and so forth and so on. And so therefore, that's what Harvard did. But it didn't work. First of all, there were objections. And you were getting the wrong kind of people into Harvard through that technique. And so they looked for other ways of doing it. Geography loomed large, and these geographic distribution requirements. The other thing that happened, as we learned from the review by Gladwell, is they decided that character was important. The essence of Harvard and of what it's doing for the world is taking people who have good quality character and training them for leadership so that our country, and to some degree our world, but our country can be a better place and it will have better leaders. And so therefore, we've got to get to the character issue. Well, what creates character in our young men and how do we recognize it? Well, one way we recognize it is by sports, because on the playing fields of America are the great tests of human character. And that, for those of you who are not Americans, you'll know that this is a distinctive quality still of American universities, that sports even counts. that sports matters, that there are sports, that there are uniforms, that there are pep rallies and floats and all of that stuff. That is bizarre in a European context. For example, the London School of Economics is not a football power. So this is odd, but in part it comes about through this idea that what you're doing in higher education is you are creating character, and therefore you've got to find out who has the stuff, the right stuff. And sports, it becomes ipso facto, on its face, an indicator of character. But there are other things, like leadership experience. What were you president of? What groups did you form? And what do your references say about you? And you need to be interviewed and by an alum to see if you have what it takes. If you are a Princeton man, do you have the stuff of a Princeton man? Well, what all of these things do, contributions, extracurricular activities, letters of reference, leadership qualities, interviews, sports stuff, all this does, what all this does is it keeps, let's just get to the quick, it keeps the Jews out. And because it provides a mechanism through which things other than merit can actually count, and can count to a degree that is unaccountable. They assign points, it's true, for one kind of quality as opposed to another, but how you decide that someone has character, how you decide they have leadership capabilities, how you decide that this kind of extracurricular activity should count more than that kind of extracurricular activity, all of that is very subjective. And in that subjectivity is the mechanism of changing the outcome, of who actually is going to get in and who is not going to get in. And so it came to be that even to this day, and I should add, that all of these universities over the years cleaned up their act. They no longer discriminate, as far as I know, against, for example, Jews. They don't, as far as I know, discriminate against blacks or Hispanics or Arab Americans or any other group, so far as I know. They are certainly diverse compared to how they were, and they make a big thing out of their diversity, as you all know, because you're connected into higher education and the issues of who gets in and who doesn't get in. But they're all there in some way, shape, or form. And some of you succeeded because of them. You did take extracurricular activities seriously. You did get advanced training in, by enrolling in colleges or junior colleges to be ahead of the game. You did get coaching, of course, some of you at least, as you were going through school, on how to make a better impact and be more impressive. And of course, you also learned, excuse me, you learned how to indeed take tests and how to succeed and how to have the right study habits and all of that sort of thing that went into your getting into one school as opposed to another school. All of those things then now enter into who gets into Harvard, who gets into Yale, and who gets into NYU. And these are then our forces, some of the forces that are at work. Now, I haven't brought up the more clear cases of legacies. And at certain times in history, at, say, Princeton, legacies and athletes together make up a majority of the student body. At Princeton, where I have friends who teach, one of whom is indeed Mitchell Denier, they actually have a word for admitting students who are being admit on academic criteria. In other words, that is a segment of the class that they actually acknowledge, because so many other segments of the entering class are entering as legacies, as the children of large donors or of athletes, because the Ivy League is an athletic league and they must field all the sports. And so they need a term for increasing what they call the academic admits, Whereas here at NYU, I'm happy to say we don't have that. We certainly don't have that term. And I think it's because the faculty assumes that the entering class is overwhelmingly made up of academic admits. And that's a degree of meritocracy, as we call it, that certainly was not true in the Ivy League at an earlier time. And by the way, one of the prideful things about NYU is that NYU, compared to other private universities in the American life and in the American East Coast, did not discriminate very much, if they did at all, against minorities, and had what we would today call a diverse student body in ways that other places didn't have, including by social class. They somehow managed to do that, even though they have always been tuition-driven to a degree that public universities are not. They somehow managed to bring that off. The power of income is very strong in American higher education. I don't want to embarrass you, but we could do another survey by my asking how many of you come from families where the family income was over $100,000 a year. That puts you way, way above the norm in American life. And I would get the vast majority of hands that would go up. I stopped doing it because of my fear of embarrassment. But when I taught at public universities, which I have in the past, the same is true. So in the California system, a public university, a public educational system, the family incomes on the average, these are numbers that are from my memory, but the average of incomes from parents of children who go to the University of California are approximately double those who go to the state college system. It's a three-tier system in California. The University of California, the state colleges, which are called things like Fresno State and Los Angeles State, and then the community colleges, it halves again. So there's a clear class hierarchy, and that getting into the University of California, a public university supported by, not so well anymore, the state budget, which means all taxpayers from all walks of life, all income classes. The University of California is actually a subsidy system through which the upper middle class can transfer their status from one generation to the next. That's putting it in the most critical light. Of course, there are exceptions to that massively in the case of the University of California, in which people come from working class homes. And that's true, I would bet, to some non-trivial extent here at NYU as well. But the point is that sociologists are always looking for things that partly explain outcomes. If we can partly explain an outcome, we get very, very happy. If we can explain an outcome, a difference across states, across different settings, different historic times, we get really excited. And the fact that, and this outcome, that the more prestigious the university, the educational institution, the higher the income of the families that are sending their kids to that school, that is what we call a robust finding, because it tends to hold across time and from one state to the next. So we know we're dealing with something that's real. One of the other ways of deciding who should get in and how you should decide it is by what succeeds, who succeeds. So we could take a look at, Harvard could or NYU could, and see what kinds of success our students have. And in a way, backfill, choose students like the ones who do succeed compared to the ones who don't succeed. And so you don't even have to figure out why. There's something, an old psychological test called the raw carrot and cooked carrot. If I ask you whether you like cooked carrots better or raw carrots better, and I later find out that people who chose raw carrots did better in life, made more income, for example, then we should just make that a criteria for admission into NYU. The people who choose raw carrots, they'll do better. We don't even have to know why. Now, that's a pretty dumb way of doing things, but some testing is based on things like that, where you don't even know why, but it's predictive. and so let's go with that. Well, if we do that, one of the great problems is, what does success mean? Let's admit students who will make more money. That would be a criteria. That's an obvious one. Well, what about we should admit people who live lives that are happier? Maybe that's who we should admit. Or maybe we should choose people who we can predict will be more generous toward other human beings. Maybe that's who we should admit. Maybe it should be people who vote more intelligently. And when they participate in public life, they know more of what's going on. After all, our democracy requires that. That's who we should admit and give the privilege of an NYU education. What I'm trying to get at here is that what success means is itself another variable, as we like to say in sociology. That's another choice to be made. That, like, you should be from Montana to balance out the people who are from the Bronx. It's another choice that has to be made that then structures what is going to be the result and how it's all going to work. I want to now talk about what makes somebody smart. Because probably in this room there's one little bit of consensus, and that is that higher education and universities like NYU should be the place of smart people. And we should admit smart people. And the tests and all of that are heavily oriented, of course, toward deciding who's smart and who's not so smart. One way of measuring that is IQ. And probably everybody in this room, raise your hand if you have taken an IQ test. Raise your hand if you've not taken an IQ test. Wow, okay, the world has changed. As I was coming up, I would be examined regularly for my IQ. And that is how intelligent I am. Everybody was measured in terms of their IQ, which was supposed to get at that raw smartness that some people have much more than other people. There is a wonderful phenomenon that has been worked out by actually a New Zealander, a scholar in New Zealand, whose name I'm going to give you in a second. It's an easy name. He's still alive, by the way. And his name is Jim Flynn. And he's famous for something called the Flynn effect. And I'm going to tell you what the Flynn effect is. It's that he studied the IQ scores of all the people in the world where IQ tests are given. And across history, IQ tests have been given for about 100 years in the United States and Europe. And what he found out was that they keep going up. They go up to such an incredible degree that someone who scored average when they first started to be giving them in the 1920s and the 1930s would be regarded as a moron today. So it implies that the population has gotten much smarter in the United States. And they've also gotten much smarter in France and in Germany and in the Netherlands, and in India, wherever this test has been given. So that means that it can't be measuring something like intrinsic intelligence, because there could be no genetic change in such a short period of time that could account for these wild and wide differences. And that then means that performance on something even like an IQ test, which is deliberately arranged to get at that core quality that supposedly exists of smartness, of intelligence, that it can't be doing that. And it's somehow a fraud. It's somehow wrong. And if something that has been engineered to go at the raw intelligence can't get it, then what good are things like interviews or these other kinds of criteria that you are all subject to, that I was subject to, that are still being the mechanisms through which entering classes at universities of the world are organized. Smartness is not all it's cracked up to be, at least by these measurements. How can we, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a study done by one of my PhD students years ago. Her name was Judy Handel. Unfortunately, she died at a very young age. Judy Handel. And she studied children learning in school at a local elementary school, upper middle class little school. And what she saw were things like this, that the teacher would hold up an object, and the object would look more or less like the object I'm going to hold up right now to you, except I'm not able to do it very, very well at all. But it's something like that. Can you see it? Something like that. Anyway, I did it in a paper, but I can simplify it and go like that. A triangle. And the teacher holds it up to the children, and they're about 3rd, 4th grade, and asks what it is. And the little children raise their hands and call out things. And they say things like, it's a sail. It's a piece of a puzzle. It's a piece of paper. All of these answers. And finally, a child says, it's a triangle. And the teacher gets very excited. This is a nice school, so the teacher, when the child says it's a sail, or the teacher says or the child says it's a piece of paper, the teacher goes, well, that's very interesting, that's very interesting. And then a child says triangle, and boom, the teacher loses it, because that's right. And the reason why it's right is because this is 4th grade, and we're starting our geometric concepts, which is what they do in 4th grade. And so this becomes a triangle. If it was art class, then they don't do geometric concepts. And a sail would be an imaginative child who has artistic qualities. But a child who says sail when it's the beginning of geometric principles, and they don't know that, the children, except some children do. They get it, that this is 4th grade, and this is going to be the introduction of geometric concepts. Now, they don't think of it like that, but maybe their parents have been holding up things like the blocks and saying, you know, Jimmy, pass me that triangle. And the child grabs the wrong thing and eventually gets the right thing. Sometimes people have referred to the hidden curriculum of the middle class home as something that trains people for knowing not just what's the difference between a triangle and a square, but much more important, what's the social context here such that the answer for Miss Jones in the 4th grade is triangle, whereas for Mr. Smith in art class, it's not triangle. It's something different where my imagination is being called for. Being able to, as we sometimes say, psych out the test, psych out the teacher, psych out life. That I'm sitting in a lecture hall at NYU, I don't wear a big funky hat, I don't take off my shirt, I don't talk to my neighbors, I don't get up and walk to the bathroom and say, excuse me, excuse me, excuse me. There's a lot of things we don't do. And that is because we are able to read the context. And so this ability to know what is the right answer at the right moment, in the right place, at the right time, is certainly only partially taught in schools. It's something that comes from other aspects of life, and it becomes another mechanism through which something like an entering freshman class at a university is formed. It's both subtle and not so subtle of what's going on. Well, now I want to look back at what we've done today and at what the lesson was and what I was trying to do. It means that a child who does not get into the advanced learning class in high school. It may be because they just walk around and say, I'm dumb. It might be that it's because they didn't know it was a triangle on that occasion. It may be because they were unaware of the other ways you need to perform to be an appropriate child, such that at each level, moving from preschool to school to kindergarten to first grade, 12th grade, and then on to college, this capacity to mobilize the world in effect on your behalf is distributed unevenly, as we say. Some people have it and some people don't. As sociologists, or have it more and have it less, or have it in certain ways compared to other ways. But those differences are being organized such that some people are organized into, let's call it privilege, and some people are being organized out of, let's call it privilege. And then there are, besides these micro mechanisms, like I was bringing up with Judy Handel's research project and the triangles in the schools, besides those subtle details, there are these macro forces, like I am a Jew in 1920, and I cannot get into Princeton. I am a Jew in Montana, if there's one, in 1920, and it is easy for me to get into Princeton. So there are these forces that are macro forces, like bold processes of discrimination, which get institutionalized, as we like to say, become things like interviews as a requirement for getting in, or tests of one kind or another as a requirement to get in. Or as we like to say often in social science, they get naturalized. We all take it for granted that that's the way, of course, you would get into school. That's what smart means if you get in. Geographical distribution, it makes sense because then we can all learn from each other, whether we come from Idaho or we come from the Bronx. These forces become naturalized, forces of amazing consequentiality, of war, of peace, of gender, of sexuality. They all become naturalized. We take them to be givens and don't realize that they are human-made and can be human-changed, that they're a result of history and of politics, and thus they are subject to alteration if we will engage them at a sociological level and practice the sociological imagination. So that's what I hope to do this semester, and I hope that you will join me in that enterprise. And the TAs is looking at the micro, looking at the macro. The tour of our course is going to be to start at the micro level and work our way, once we get beyond this week, from the micro to the macro, and end up at very large-scale issues. So thanks for coming today.